Hello, I'm Patrick Cronin, Asia Pacific Security Chair here at the Hudson Institute, and today it's a great pleasure to welcome back to Hudson Jonas Parello-Plesner, who is not only a former senior fellow here at Hudson, but is a distinguished Danish diplomat and now currently the executive director of the Alliance of Democracies Foundation, headquartered in Copenhagen, Denmark, and founded by former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen. Jonas has written a lot of things over his career, but most recently, The Battle of Taiwan is a really good short read if you want to understand why Taiwan matters, how conflict might break out, and how to prevent it. And it's coming from a leading European thought leader, which makes it very important, but also a diplomat who has experience in Beijing and his own personal experience with Taiwan over the years. So, Anders, welcome back to Hudson.
Thank you, Patrick.
I know why I think Taiwan matters, not least because it is a leading flashpoint for conflict in the Indo-Pacific and Asia. And we worry so much that the conflicts we see now in Ukraine, because of Russia's aggression, the wider war in the Middle East, the fact that that could come to the Indo-Pacific and lead to a cataclysmic conflict is no small matter. And everybody is jockeying for position, working on diplomacy, economic resilience, and thinking about the political future of these democratically governed people in Taiwan, who just celebrated, by the way, their 113th anniversary for the Republic of China, slightly more than the People's Republic of China, which celebrated their 75th anniversary just recently as well. So tell us, Anders, why from your perspective, again, coming from Europe in particular, why does Taiwan matter?
Thank you, Patrick, and great to be back here at Hudson. That's a real sort of personal pleasure. For me, if I wind the clock back a little bit, almost 20 years ago in 2005, I was the head of the China and Northeast Asia unit in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. At that time, quite sort of hopeful that China's reform and opening up. China had just entered a couple of years before that, the World Trade Organization. That would lead both to continued opening and possibly also a liberalization of the Chinese society. That year, 2005, I was invited by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We were down in Xiamen, coastal city, close to one of the Taiwanese islands, Kinmen. And I remember on that tour, the Chinese diplomat telling me how peaceful everything would be and how trade would kind of solve everything. And a couple of years later, you did have Ma Ying-jeou become president in Taiwan and opening up a lot of that trade with China. That, of course, was very far away from how things turned out with China. And now here, almost 2 decades later, as I did this book and part of that research, I was in Taiwan on the other side in Kinmen and standing there looking over to Xiamen, to the mainland, and now the foundation that I work for is sanctioned by the Chinese government, probably because of the work we do with including Taiwan among the democratic family at our yearly Copenhagen Democracy Summit. So it's also really been a personal kind of journey, but then you might ask, okay, what does this matter then for ordinary citizens? This is kind of my story, but I think there are 3 real big reasons why Taiwan matters to all of us, even though you could say we're sitting here 8,000 miles roughly away from Taiwan, and it's a small island, kind of the size of Maryland. But the first one is economic, and it's actually economic and technological. When we have these gadgets here that all of us rely so much on, smartphones, iPhones, it's really the Taiwanese companies, TSMC in particular, that are behind kind of the semiconductor production of the world. So 90% of the world's most advanced and smallest semiconductors are produced in Taiwan. That means that estimates of what would it mean if there were a conflict to break out in Taiwan, that would really, in many ways, stop sort of the world economy. Rhodium Group has done probably one of the more conservative assessments, which values it at $3 billion US. So that would be kind of the size of California's economy that got disappeared overnight in case of a conflict. Bloomberg, leading up to the Taiwanese presidential elections in January, they did another analysis with putting at a sort of staggering $10 billion US dollars, that would mean that it wouldn't just be California, but it would also be Texas, it would also be New York, and it would also be Florida combined that would add up to the same 10 trillion that kind of disappeared from the world economy. So on the economic side, you could say this is really the mother of all conflicts. And then there's the military geopolitical side, the fact that this is not just a conflict that's likely just to entail the Chinese potentially attacking Taiwan, but also the US being involved in that. And that would, of course, pit the world's two largest powers, the world's two largest militaries, the world's two largest navies against each other in the Taiwan Strait. And whoever would come out victorious out of that would also very much define who is the leading power in the 21st century. So I think that's the other big reason. And then last but not least, now working in a democracy organization with close connections with Taiwan, I think that the fact that it will also define whether we live in a free or less free world if 23 million Taiwanese were suddenly to be subjugated by the Chinese Communist Party and have to fall under their thrall. I think that would be a much less free world. So it also really matters now that we also have the war in Ukraine, which is also with one autocratic neighbor attacking the smaller democratic neighbor. It really matters the fate of Taiwan to all of us, whether we live in this less or kind of more free world. So that's really the reason why I wrote it, and also why I wrote it. So thanks for calling it an easy read. I really try to say, I think we all know as expert and as you are in particular, Patrick, how much this matters. But I think ordinary people, when you tell these things, I often also ask in public events how many know TSMC. And it's still a relatively low number, even though this is one of the world's largest companies, the largest publicly traded company in Asia, and the impact it has on our daily lives. So I think this debate about Taiwan is really crucial, and that's also kind of really been my main mission with writing the book, was getting that out there to ordinary people, ordinary Americans, and where I come from, ordinary Europeans. So I did it originally in a Danish language version as well, which was the way to spark debate in our small country about it as well.
Well, it translates well, and I think it's an easy read in part because you weave the facts and data into narratives, into stories, personal stories often, and I hope we'll hear a few of them in this broadcast. But I wanted to just go back this week, Double 10 speech by President Lingde. He, in many ways, had an olive branch there for the Chinese, and encouraging them, challenging them to say, what are you doing for peace? What are you doing for peace to wind down the Russian military machine? Not much, not in a good way. What are you doing for peace in the Indo-Pacific? And yet the Foreign Ministry, of course, predictably has lambasted the speech already. They were poised to do that before he spoke a word, I think. But when you think about the reflexiveness of the Communist Party of China going after every word that is uttered, especially by President Lai, I mean, is this insecurity, or is it just good old Leninist political warfare, or is it both, maybe?
That's a really good question. I think probably a mix of the two, but it is clear that I think the last years we've seen China down a path where Xi Jinping has several times evoked that like the military option is there, and it's something that they're ready to use, and it's of course something they're training for since August 2022 when then Speaker of the House of Representatives Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. The Chinese military navy have sort of enacted some of the largest military exercises in decades, and they basically kept them up at occasion. Let's see now if there hasn't typically been a sort of military response to Taiwanese 10-10 speeches. There could be. So basically, they're really rehearsing for the kind of the military component of a possible subjugation of Taiwan. I also personally thought that President Lingde's speech was really good, very kind of balanced, and did have, as you call it, kind of the olive branch element of reaching out to the Chinese, and for a DPP leader, probably also a little bit courageous by using the Republic of China kind of language a lot more. So in that sense, you could say. So I mean, but that unfortunately I think on the Chinese side, there seems to be a sort of really a kind of march towards, particularly also by Xi Jinping, reportedly having given the PLA the mission to be in 2027, capability-wise, ready to invade Taiwan. So there's a certain military logic that is kind of starting to pervade the Chinese thinking.
So let's pick up on that military concern. You also wrote a chapter in The Boiling Moat that Matt Pottinger edited that is an excellent small volume, another quick read, but a collection of authors in this case, looking at how to make the Taiwan Strait a boiling moat and therefore deter China from using aggression, using force. But they seem to be moving inch by inch toward that capability that Xi Jinping has ordered and commanded from his PLA, despite corruption, despite other problems, his distrust of the military. He wants them to be ready for combat operations by 2027. But his strategy still seems to be mostly political warfare and economic strangulation. You talk about the anaconda strategy as well, this, which could be preparation for a blockade. And as with all things Beijing, it seems to be all of the above, right? So every day they're getting better toward a combat capability, should they pull the trigger. But their strategy is really to absolutely dissuade Taiwan, to dissuade Japan, the United States, and others, to certainly dissuade the Europeans from supporting Taiwan and what they consider to be Taiwan movement toward independence. So when you think about the international preparations, US, NATO allies, others, on for deterring the military option, what you wrote in Matt Pottinger's excellent book, how much weight should we put on the military deterrent element as just a kind of a building block before we get to the political, diplomatic, the economic, and the narrative questions about Taiwan?
I think all of them are really important. So I think if we only sort of focus on the military, we might exactly miss that the People's Republic of China can do a lot of these things through economic means, through cyber, and many different ways of basically trying to sort of strangulate Taiwanese society. So I think it's important that we not only just basically prepare for sort of the D-Day scenario of massive sort of Chinese attack on Taiwan, but also many of all these smaller. We see what the Chinese Coast Guard is doing with the Philippines at the moment. Those kind of tactics, where here they use water cannons, they use lasers, they use it to sort of disrupt the Philippines, and it all stays below the threshold of war, meaning that U.S., who's a treaty ally of the Philippines, it doesn't, in that sense, sort of trigger an activation of that treaty. And so I think they're willing to use all of that as well with Taiwan, saying maybe there would be at some point a quarantine and they could block some goods, and we would end up in situations that would be similar to something we'd seen under the Cold War, a kind of Berlin blockade kind of scenario where at first everybody would rally around Taiwan, but then the Chinese might be willing to keep this up for a long time and do so. So I think there's this whole sort of series of scenarios, and also, of course, first and foremost, how the Taiwanese themselves prepare for that. And that was part of what I also did interviews on in the book, sort of speaking on, of course, the military side with military experts and generals and admirals, but then also on, for example, the digital side, speaking how does Taiwan prepare here on both Chinese disinformation in elections, also cyber attacks, and how to basically safeguard their critical infrastructure. Taiwan is quite reliable when it comes to internet on a couple of sea cables. And we did see one of the outlying islands, Matsu, where the internet cable was suddenly cut by a Chinese trawler. So when I met with and interviewed then Digital Minister Audrey Tang here in the book, her lessons also from the Ukraine war was two things. We need free uninterrupted internet, and we need international coverage. That's sort of the things that we can't be sort of blackened out, which what Russia succeeded with back in 2014 when they took Crimea, that basically we were not really aware about what was really going on before it was all a fait accompli. So for example, the Taiwanese work on having satellites in different levels of the Middle Earth and different kind of positions, and having different providers as well, so that they're sure that they're not in a time of crisis and conflict, they actually have still access through internet. So it's on a multi-range of things where you have to prepare that kind of deterrence. So the boiling moat, which is Matt Pottinger's kind of favorite term, is of course in military terms, but there's also, I think, a whole level of resilience, starting with the Taiwanese, that's necessary.
Indeed, let's pick up on that. The political will of the Taiwanese to fight. On the one hand, Taiwan has not been famously overspending on defense, even though they've been in a very precarious position. At the same time, Taiwan seems like they would stand up and fight, and they want to, that they're preparing for both an asymmetric strategy as well as having advanced conventional forces to try to buy time for others to provide that support. And the United States, meanwhile, for all of our famous lack of staying power in the view of many people, we seem to be still very much engaged internationally and not likely to really walk away from this engagement. And yet, Europeans, Japanese, Australians, Koreans, I mean, there are a lot of countries around the world that are very interested in peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. So there seems to be a lot of political will there, but that's not stopping Beijing from trying to break political will. So, and you're wearing the Ukraine flag on your lapel here, Jonas, so I have to say, in the third year of Vladimir Putin's special 3-day military operation,
yes.
Do you think the Chinese are underestimating the political will of Taiwan and the international community?
I think so, and of course I hope so. It's sort of the takeaway I get from when I speak to Taiwanese, and I think if you go beyond, again, the purely military, you also have it in the civil society, that these training courses, because since Taiwan is an island, so in difference to Ukraine, where refugees have been able to go to other European friendly countries, Taiwan people would be internally displaced. And there, as part of the book and my reportage in Taiwan, I joined some of these self-defense courses where families are training how to get hold of each other in case there isn't a internet, how to do first aid. And so I think a lot of these things are also kind of an important part of like the total resilience of the Taiwanese society. And actually one of the workshops of these self-defense I was on the slideshow up there, there's suddenly President Biden that appeared, and then with a saying in Chinese, and as I was trying to read through, I initially thought this is going to be his words about that he would defend Taiwan if China attacked. It was not. It was actually from Afghanistan, and about if a people doesn't want to defend itself, like the US power can do very little, and which was then used here to say, I mean, the first line of defense is really that the Taiwanese are willing to stand up, because if you had a Chinese invasion that ended up being similar to a Crimea scenario in 2014 and took over Taiwan in a day or two, I think that there would be very little even that the world's greatest superpower could really kind of do about it. So of course the Taiwanese have to sort of be willing to fight. And then you have all these debates which can get a bit technical on the asymmetric strategy, what's the right one, all the different Taiwanese parts of the Army, Navy, and Air Force, of course, have some of their components to say this is very asymmetric and so on. And I think that's a valid discussion, trying to figure out which was also really the interesting part about Matt's book with some of the other contributions than mine, which is very detailed on what is really the battle plan for gearing up Taiwanese military deterrence as well.
Indeed, yeah, I'm thinking of Ivan's chapter in The Boiling Moat, I mean, among others, I mean, looking very specifically at the hard power that's needed to gird the diplomacy. I agree, though, I think the political will is there, and that's what was so important in Ukraine, right? When Ukraine survived the first day, and then they wanted to fight, it was a matter of defending people who had a sovereign right to defend their sovereignty, member of the UN Charter as well. So, what about the economic resilience, though? Because yes, they have a silicon shield to some extent that we talked about, but at the same time, China is trying its utmost to be in a position to blockade and to withstand that. There's another good report that came out a few months ago, Ike Fryman and his co-author, looking at an avalanche decoupling. That is, could the international community impose such searing economic sanctions to make it clear to China that aggression will be extraordinarily costly, and really will undermine all of the achievement of the China dream that Xi Jinping has been trying to work toward. It doesn't mean he would stop. I mean, once you reach the point of deciding to use force, I think it's probably very hard to deter that. but at the same time, it would exact an enormous penalty. How do you think about building up the economic resilience of Taiwan further and our ability to enact the kind of economic pressure to shape this environment?
Well, let's start with the Taiwanese. I mean, they're of course also already doing part of this. They've, in many ways, tried to reorient their economy from being very heavily, which it still is, reliant on the mainland to Southeast Asia, to Europe, to the US and Japan, to basically have a sort of broader network also on trade and investments with democratic allies. I do think, as I also argue in the chapter, that the part of deterrence that Europeans can contribute to is really on the economic side, is of saying to the Chinese, what you've seen with Russia has really been not just that government enacted sanctions, but also that companies in Europe have been willing to take losses and basically also voluntarily move out of the Russian market. And I think that, and I think has been a bit of a surprise to the Chinese leadership in the sense that they have otherwise seen that Western companies were basically extremely spineless. I mean, if we have examples like the debacle in 2018 over how to list Taiwan for airlines and American ones as well, where the Chinese basically forced their hand and said, if you don't kind of list Taiwan as a province of China, you will not be able to have landing rights in China. We had a similar example with Marriott that made a sort of questionnaire with PRC, Taiwan, and Hong Kong listed as each independent entities, and the Chinese used their market power over Marriott hotels in China to basically force their hands. So I do think that has been something that they had not seen coming, that you've actually had companies be willing to take quite substantial losses out of basically a sort of values decision of seeing Russia leaving the international order and norms of behavior, and if China were to do something similar by militarily attacking Taiwan. So I think as Europeans, part of our preventive diplomacy should be to give that message to the Chinese leadership as much as we can direct it to Xi Jinping, because I think it's increasingly a system like Putin's as well, where there's an echo chamber around the leader. And then we need a debate inside our countries with our business community that this could happen, because there is a little bit still, even though Putin did invade Ukraine, there's still a slight, at least in Europe, in some quarters thinking, oh, this is never going to happen with Taiwan. But particularly because of the Silicon Shield, it's going to be so much a loss to the whole world economy. But of course, Xi Jinping is like Putin, a dictator. So if his logic is what will further my regime's survival, and at some point say that will be taking Taiwan militarily, and I'm willing to let my people suffer more, even though, yes, this will mean a huge collapse of technological globalization. But I can maybe shoulder that better than and the willingness to suffer. So in that sense, we shouldn't count it out there on the economic argument, basically then saying then it's not going to happen. But I think be part of that proactive deterrence of saying, as you were also saying, for Xi Jinping, it will destroy another component, like the whole idea of delivering a China in 2049 at the 100 years, that is the leading nations on all parameters. I actually personally don't want to really live in 2049 and have the People's Republic of China led by the Communist Party be the leading country in all. But that is his vision, and of course that's guiding it. And you could say saying attacking Taiwan will completely disrupt that for you. So I do hope we can be sort of have a part of deterrence based on economics.
Well, you're essentially alluding to the fact that we have to think long-term, not just short-term, because they're both connected, and they're connected in China's policy, Xi Jinping's dream, the fact that he's likely to be leader even 10 years from now. I mean, who's going to stop him? There's nobody in his way. He's gathered all the titles. Nobody can say no to him. So if he decides in 10 years' time, rather than 2027, that he wants to use force, it's time to bring unification home, and he pulls that trigger, we're in that situation. So we have to do everything we can before then to work together to try to make that an unthinkable option, a really unpalatable option at least for China. And that's not going against the status quo. This is where there's a difference. I had an argument with a Chinese friend who recently visited Hudson despite the fact that we're sanctioned. And we talked about our different views of the status quo. So Americans think of the status quo on the Taiwan Strait as we do not support an independent Taiwan. And it's listed along with the 3 communique and the 6 reassurances when U.S. administration officials talk about this. But that's not satisfactory, of course, to the Chinese. They want much more than that. They want obeisance to their narrative of the one China principle, essentially, and their interpretation of the 3 communiques, even though they were cast in a very different era. I mean, even just the Shanghai communique talking about the United States would be willing to wind down arms sales to Taiwan over time, that was predicated on cross-strait peace moving forward. And that's not what China's done. That's not where they've moved. That's not what this coercion, this harassment, this strangulation, the anaconda strategy, the cyber intrusions are all about. So when you think about the narrative coming out of China, you've thought about this a lot. You've talked to the Chinese. You're not going to shake hands with Xi Jinping. You say again in your book, probably.
Doubt it.
How do you think about the Chinese approach to the narrative on the Taiwan issue?
I think you're very right in pointing out that the Chinese are very much trying to erode the status quo, and we need reactions that are adapted to that, because there isn't really a status quo anymore. I mean, there used also to be what we talked about as a median line in the Taiwan Strait, which is a sort of informal military line. Now that the Chinese are crossing it with their airplanes every day. So that's also, I think, what we need to think into our reaction is really how do we then respond to that? And you could say it's on one China policy more broadly. It's been something that the Chinese, also in my own time as a diplomat, the way they've been lifting the bar kind of continuously. I mean, in the zeros, it was like, don't see Dalai Lama, he's a terrible separatist. Then most Europeans, I think I was probably part of the last Dalai Lama visit with a Danish prime minister back in 2009, then as a serving diplomat. And then I think a lot of Europeans wrongly thought, okay, now we've sort of appeased the Chinese like on this question. Yeah, but then they just like come with a new one and hire them on Taiwan, also in the South China Sea, which didn't used to be seen as like a core interest of China, but has gradually been listed there and is now also among the things where they're like, this is unnegotiable, and you have, by having signed up to a one China policy, it also means that you sign up to the South China Sea. It means you sign up to that Taiwan is an unalienable part of it. And I think where we also have a joint battle and should help jointly, both US and Europeans, is working with Global South and also with democratic partners all over, because often there the Chinese get them to sign up to communiques. They don't think too much about where they particularly add this as Taiwan as an inalienable part. They've done it at the UN as well, where they've been managed completely to sort of obfuscate how the original UN resolution that gave the seat to the People's Republic of China, and say this is the international norm that also regulates that Taiwan is a province of China. It's said nowhere in that resolution, and they've been kind of using their stronghold over UN organizations to basically eradicate Taiwan from the map. So I think there as well we have a sort of big job ahead, and where the Chinese have been ahead because they've been gradually kind of changing this and undermining the status quo in so many areas. And I think, unfortunately, we've only relatively recently come to task with how much this is a sort of very multi-pronged strategy for completely eradicating Taiwan's international space.
Jonas, I wonder if I can ask you a very big strategic question in terms of, at the risk
of... You can. I'll try to answer, but I don't know if I have the answer.
At oversimplification, but we seem to have two strategic choices here. One of them is this sort of competitive coexistence with China or regime change. This has to end with something. Now, maybe we don't have to answer that question because that's not in the cards right now, so we're really in this competitive coexistence one way or the other. But so maybe it's a false question, but it does seem to me the Chinese don't seem to understand that we could live with competitive coexistence, but they don't seem to be able to live with democracy right at their doorstep. I mean, that's one of the challenges. They don't seem to be able to respect those lines. But how do you view this? I mean, you work at a foundation promoting democracy. Chinese are looking for color revolutions, in a box to come out and grab them. It's really a question, though, about their legitimacy, isn't it? I mean, about the party's legitimacy. Is the party, as the economy's growth slows down, are they now increasingly worried about their legitimacy slipping away?
No, very good question. I follow, of course, your debate among experts and China practitioners here with Matt Pottinger and Mike Gallagher arguing for sort of a strategy of winning, which some have interpreted as a regime change strategy as well. In one sense, I might tackle it differently and say, maybe it doesn't matter that much, because if you look at it from the point of view of Xi Jinping, he's already defined that he thinks what the US is fundamentally up to is regime change. So however much you send out appeasing messages from State Department here, I'm not sure that he changes his view that this is like fundamentally what the US is about, whether they say it as a strategy or whether they don't. So in a sense, you could say, seen from the sort of point of view of the adversary, this is already what they're expecting. This is why he early on in his time in office, signed off on document number 9, basically saying democracy, liberal values are not just something we don't want in China, but it's actually a threat to us globally as well. And which is why you, over this last decade, has seen a PRC that's been really aggressive in trying to curb the debate inside free societies. I mean, when you look at our sanctions, what they're basically saying is a foundation in Denmark is not allowed to do a summit inside a free country where they have a Taiwanese speaker, and we are allowed to sanction them for that. So that's actually kind of the level of dislike of freedom of expression, of having sort of alternative views out there, even inside free societies. So in that sense, I would maybe this is a diplomatic way of dodging your good geopolitical question, saying it almost maybe doesn't matter which strategy the US publicly pursues, because the Chinese will kind of assume this is part of undermining Xi Jinping one way or the other. And I personally actually, then to be not diplomatic, think it should. And of course now with somebody who is sanctioned, but also kind of like the Chinese people like to travel around in China and can't do it any longer, I of course start to have an increasingly vested interest in regime change, so that this would be once again a nice country to visit for all of us that are on the sanctions list.
Yes. I'm thinking of a poll that the Chinese recently released that was an academic poll, so it was a well-done poll, but saying that the Chinese, not surprisingly, have a very unfavorable view of the Americans and Japan right now, a very positive view of Russia, which, of course, you're thinking about China's real interests. Are their real interests aligned with Russia? And are they not considering the economic growth that they gained by working with Japan, the United States, and Europe over the years? And we're in a very different situation right now, which may be temporary or may be generational. We don't know. But it is a huge question about how to gauge Chinese perceptions of our actions. And I think this is a question for Lai Ching-te, former President Tsai Ing-wen, going to Prague, for instance. The fact that President Lai was not that provocative in his double 10 speech, at least as much as even as the inaugural speech that he gave. How much does that matter, do you think, these kind of actions that could be seen as a pretext or could be used as a pretext by Beijing for more coercive action, even aggression against Taiwan? Not to mention sanctions against small foundations that are no threat whatsoever, but nonetheless, China feels insecure enough it has to sanction us and you, and to show that they're tough, I guess. What is it that we should really be worried about? Do we have to be that worried about crossing these red lines, or does Taiwan have to be worried about crossing these red lines? Does the next U.S. president have to be worried about telephoning the president from the airport?
Well, I think the military component of deterrence is really the main part of a matching Xi Jinping's ambition. So if that happens, and that's also sort of the battle plan in Matt Pottinger's book, The Boiling Moat. So I think that's fundamental. I would, though, as a former diplomat, say I do think words, dialogue also matter. So I think it's important, and that's also why sort of like Ching-te's conciliatory speech, I think it's important because it does test, okay, will the Chinese leadership in some way bite on this? And that should keep being tested as well, because I of course, sitting here, I don't dream of living in a world where within the next decade, Taiwan gets invaded. I want to see a free Taiwan that prospers and doesn't have to enter war. So whatever we can do to get to that goal, which includes diplomacy as well. So I don't think that should be completely discounted at all as well.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I also agree. Diplomacy is extremely important. The question is, how do we get some diplomatic traction that matters? So even of those of us who want to cooperate on areas where we have to cooperate on climate change. I mean, there's really no choice for the planet. But don't expect China to do any favors for you on any other issue where there's geopolitical and strategic competition. That's the problem with that. So there's still the problem, how do we negotiate or how do we deal with them on issues where they're different? So let's just take the South China Sea. I mean, look at the behavior of China Coast Guard, maritime militia, as well as the PLA Navy, with this imaginary dashed line. I mean, yes, the map has a history to it, but the lines don't have any meaning in contemporary international law.
They don't.
And yet, that's what they're trying to enforce on the Philippines, on Vietnam, and on other claimant states. And so we can say, okay, it's just Taiwan, but it's not just Taiwan. I mean, they are, throughout their entire maritime region, intruding on their neighbors and imposing their domestic view and their historical claims approach to international law.
Japan as well.
And on Japan as well. So, I mean, how do we negotiate with a country that's going to use their use historical claims rather than international law to discuss international law?
No, that is a big challenge. I think actually Europeans there missed a bit of a chance, and I've been arguing that in my home country, Denmark, as well, with the fact that there was a ruling in 2016, an arbitration ruling initiated by the Philippines that basically legally came out and said that the Chinese claims were void according to international maritime law. That was something we should have built on much more. I do know that it was also linked to politics and the fact that President Duterte became president of the Philippines and did not really follow up on that ruling that was initiated by his predecessor. That also made it harder, but still that's somewhere also because for Denmark, Kingdom of Denmark, which includes Greenland, we have actually maritime disputed areas up near the North Pole with the Russians, where we until now, it's actually happened in a sort of UNCLOS procedure according to international law. But if the Chinese are successful with basically land grabbing the whole South China Sea, why on earth should the Russians keep sort of having this nice legal affair with the Kingdom of Denmark? I don't see that happen. I would see a really negative repercussion for us. So that's why I've been arguing to Europeans. This is, in a sense, far away from us, but it's the repercussions on international law and, of course, also on trade that goes through maritime trade that goes through the South China Sea will be huge for us if it's suddenly the Chinese that control all of that. I had the pleasure in 2018 to go out with the French Navy on one of their freedom of operation and sort of sail through and see some of these Mischief Reef, Subi Reef, Fury Cross Reef, and where things that you on satellite photos had these sort of small 1 meter shoals before, and now you have, like as in the James Bond movie Dr. No, you have these completely artificially built islands, and it's actually also quite scary in the way that the Chinese really have been willing to muster the mix of political and military will to kind of build these dual-use facilities on all these reefs.
Especially when that militarization of the South China Sea came after the legal proceedings. I mean, this was, the Philippines went to see legal redress of a legitimate sort of dispute, and this is how China responded.
And after promising something different to the U.S. government. I was here in 2015 when Xi Jinping visited and stood
the Rose Garden.
Exactly next to President Obama and was like, on Scout's honor, we will not militarize the South China Sea, and then they went back and did it.
In a huge way.
Yeah.
So that's the concern here. So it's not, I have Chinese students at Carnegie Mellon University. I love all these students are great. I mean, they're brilliant, hardworking. They want a future where they can make money, and provide for their family and education and travel freely. But they're increasingly worried about travel and speaking out. What is your message to the Chinese about how we can work through these differences, including even disputes over Taiwan, and do this peacefully?
Yeah, that's a really good question also because very often the Chinese Communist Party instrumentalized the whole Chinese population and says 1.4 billion are very disappointed with what you said. And so I've heard that very often as a diplomat and of course never having polled the Chinese population on some of this. And I do think you see, for example, Free Chinese that live abroad having a different point of view. It was a small demonstration, but there was the demonstration when Xi Jinping visited that had banners saying, we don't want a war over Taiwan in our name. So I think at the moment you can move Chinese outside of sort of the Chinese propaganda system. They might actually have different opinions. So I would, of course, hope somewhat idealistically to where we are right now that Taiwan became much more of an inspiration for mainland China as well, to where they could take their society. I mean, Taiwan now is it's not just a flourishing democracy, as we often say, but if you look at international rankings, it's among top 10 in the Economist Intelligence Unit. So it's also one that's actually really innovative on democracy. We saw it during the COVID period as well, with really solutions that were both tech-based, were respectful of individual liberties, and we saw all the opposite on the mainland. So of course, there my dose of idealism would hope that this at some point could infuse into the Chinese people saying, hey, we want more of this. Also now that the social contract that the Communist Party used to have with the Chinese people is sort of broken. It used to be, okay, we give you growth, enormous growth each decade. You get new cars, new apartments, and then you shut up and let us rule. And now growth is anemic, and you had the COVID period where you had people on the streets, even in this Xi Jinping surveillance society as well. So I also think we shouldn't underestimate that, like, yeah, maybe there will be a change in China at some point.
Jonas, in the few minutes we have remaining, I wonder if I can ask you two final questions. First one is where the Europeans fit into this coalition of the willing to have the political will and the capability to stand up to coercion and aggression if necessary. And then ultimately I want to ask you about your thinking about America's sort of reliability in the future. But on the European question first.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, what I try to advocate in the book and my kind of message to Europeans is that the importance of Taiwan on all these parameters and why we therefore have to take it serious to be part of at least and as a minimum this preventive economic deterrence. Is all of Europe there, which of course EU consists of 27 member states? No, you have some like Czech Republic where former Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen is visiting these days, like Lithuania, that really been kind of leading a sort of value battle for democratic Taiwan, has been willing to take the economic coercion from China on that. And then you have other countries, and I guess Germany really as the largest economy is the pivot on all of this, and it's not even the German economy overall, there's the German auto industry, which has like a huge over-reliance on the Chinese market, and of course is extremely worried about what this would mean for their business if China were to sort of subject the German economy to higher levels of economic coercion. So it's still a big moving picture inside Europe. You did have President Macron of France as well when he was in China, that talked about Europe as a kind of third pole and neutral. He did later modify that, but still kind of said it. For me, I think another way I try to sort of rouse Europeans is through the Ukraine conflict as well, of showing them all the parallels, and also the fact that we have the Chinese now on dual use and other things, basically supplying the Russians with the means to continue this war, which also means for us, we actually see China in our own area, which has often been the dividing line. Otherwise, Europeans saying, well, they're still kind of far away from us and we mostly trade with them. But we actually see them in our area right now, helping an aggressor fuel their war. So in that sense, I think for Europeans, it's coming home to dawn that China is a global threat, but also a kind of regional and local threat for us in Europe.
And would you just add a sentence or two about history here? Because in the Chinese narrative, the Europeans are still back in colonialism. You know, they're going back several hundred years and thinking about a history that is checkered, rather than the Europe that we see now trying to contribute to the growth and freedom and the survival of the planet and of international relations. So you want to just address that narrative point that the Chinese love to say, oh, the Europeans have no place here. You don't belong in Asia.
I mean, if we look at the modern history of the PRC's engagement with Europe, we have taken a massive bet on that China would become a much nicer country than it is. And I think it's been a kind of rude awakening for a lot of Europeans in general, maybe how the world turned out post the 1990s, where we expected trade and liberalization basically to make us all interdependent and happy. So in that sense, I would say it's Europeans that have taken a very long time actually really listening to the signals from Beijing that this is a different kind of world that they want. And so I don't see, I mean, apart from as rhetoric, the sort of the Opium War history playing any role in modern relations.
As they drive their Volkswagens around. Well, listen, a serious question on the U.S. election. Okay, we have a pivotal choice here in America to face. Whatever happens, though, the next president's going to be challenged for the next 4 years with this Taiwan issue and dealing with China and fashioning this. From your view as an expert, as a former diplomat, as somebody who's traveling the world, and as a European as well, how do you view America's reliability going forward? Are you worried about it, or are you confident that this is something that the United States can work through? You know our country so well.
Well, thanks, Patrick. But I mean, as we talked about before we got into here, it's really hard to sort of make solid predictions on this election. But of course, I've been here as well, meeting with people in the campaigns and trying to gauge primarily on Ukraine as well, which is really for us Europeans, of course, primordial, because the war it's a hot war going on right now, where what we're trying to avoid here with Taiwan is, of course, another war erupting. So U.S. reliability, I think it is a big question for us on Ukraine first and foremost, but overall, how much does the U.S. want to engage in the world, sort of going forward? We'd had the discussion of the so-called forever wars, and that was also part of the withdrawal of Afghanistan. I don't see anybody else that at least I would like to be on the world stage and trying to give a helping hand. So I really personally, of course, invested in to see, but I don't have even though we would all like as European, I don't have a vote in your elections. So I just really also hope, on a personal note, that you will have good and peaceful elections. I was an election observer back in 2016 myself out in Virginia. So I've seen it happen nice and peacefully, and I do hope that will be the case this time around, and new leadership come in will also look to engage with the world and allies, Europe and Taiwan as well.
From your lips to God's ears, as they say, Jonas. Thank you so much, Jonas Parello-Plesner. The battle for Taiwan, why Taiwan matters, and everything about U.S., Europe, and China in this discussion. Congratulations on another great publication. Great to see you back here at Hudson, and Godspeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick.